The alien soldier had been part of countless missions before, but none as disastrous as this one. Born and bred for combat, his kind prided themselves on efficiency and strength. Every soldier knew their role: attack, conquer, retreat if necessary. But no one had prepared him for what would happen when retreat meant abandonment. His people had always seen weakness as something to discard, not mend. Injured and left behind on a desolate, forgotten planet, he had no choice but to face that reality now. His name was Kaltan, a proud warrior from a species known for their ruthlessness in battle. His squad had been deployed on this remote world to secure resources crucial for their empire's ongoing war. It was supposed to be a routine mission: land, extract, leave. But things had gone wrong. A surprise ambush by a rival force had crippled their mission before they could even properly set up camp. In the ensuing chaos, Kaltan had been injured, his leg shattered by an explosion, his armor cracked. He had radioed for extraction, confident that his squad wouldn't leave him behind. He was wrong. The last thing he remembered was watching the ships take off without him, disappearing into the orange sky. His desperate calls for help had gone unanswered, leaving him to face the brutal desert landscape with only a few days' worth of rations and no hope of rescue. His species didn't bother with the weak. If you couldn't keep up, you were left behind. It was the cold logic of their empire. Days passed in a blur of pain and hunger. His leg throbbed constantly, and his supplies were dwindling fast. Kaltan knew he wouldn't survive much longer. He wasn't afraid of death. He had seen it too many times to fear it. But the thought of being forgotten, of being discarded like some malfunctioning piece of equipment, gnawed at him. He had been loyal. He had fought countless battles. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. The planet was merciless. Sandstorms ravaged the barren landscape, and the intense heat beat down on him relentlessly. The nights were no better, cold and silent, save for the distant howls of predators lurking in the darkness. Every breath he took felt heavy, every movement a reminder of his injury and the inevitable end that awaited him. Kaltan's thoughts drifted back to his people. They would already have moved on, his absence barely noted. To them, he was just another soldier, another expendable tool in their vast war machine. They valued efficiency, not loyalty. Sacrifice was expected, but it was never honored. He had believed in their cause once, believed in their strength and superiority. Now, stranded and alone, he saw the flaw in their thinking. They didn't value life, not truly. Not like he had started to. On the fourth day, Kaltan's comm device crackled to life. For a brief moment, hope flared in his chest. Perhaps they had reconsidered. Perhaps they were coming back for him after all. But the voice that came through wasn't familiar. It wasn't from his people. It was human. Unidentified life form. We've spotted you. Do you need assistance? Kaltan's first instinct was to refuse. He knew of humans, of their weakness, their primitive technology. His kind had always regarded them as insignificant, a species still crawling out of their evolutionary infancy. They had no place in the galaxy's great conflicts, and certainly no power to help him. But his situation was dire, and his rational mind told him that any help, even from a species as lowly as humans, was better than none. He activated the comm, his voice strained. I am stranded. My own have abandoned me. There was a pause on the other end. He imagined the humans discussing whether or not it was worth risking their lives to help an alien soldier, especially one from a species known for its aggression. After a few moments, the voice returned. We'll be there shortly. Hang tight. Kaltan couldn't fathom why they would help him. His people would never have extended the same courtesy. In their eyes, an injured human would have been left to die, deemed too weak to continue. Yet here these humans were, coming to his aid for no reason he could understand. He couldn't help but feel suspicion gnawing at him. What did they stand to gain? Surely they had ulterior motives. But when the human shuttle arrived, there was no malice in their actions, no hidden agenda. A small group of soldiers emerged, and one, a woman with short, cropped hair and a stern expression, approached him. She kneeled beside him, inspecting his injuries without a word. Her expression softened slightly as she looked up. You're lucky we found you, she said, her voice calm but firm. "We'll get you out of here." Kaltan stared at her, unable to comprehend this gesture of kindness. For his people, compassion was a weakness. It made you vulnerable, open to manipulation and betrayal. Yet here were these humans, offering him a lifeline with no expectation of reward. He felt a strange sense of gratitude welling up inside him, mixed with confusion. Why were they doing this? What drove them to help someone like him? As the humans helped him aboard their ship, Kaltan remained silent, his mind racing with questions. He didn't trust them, couldn't trust them. His whole life had been built on the belief that only the strong survived, and kindness was a mask for weakness. But now, faced with the reality of his situation, he couldn't deny the truth. The humans were not like his people. They were not abandoning him. As the ship lifted off, leaving the desolate planet behind, Kaltan looked back one last time. It felt like he was leaving more than just a world of sand and rock. He was leaving behind a part of himself, the part that believed in the ruthless efficiency of his people, the part that had once scorned weakness and compassion. And in its place, something new was growing, though he didn't yet understand what it was. The journey on the human ship was unlike anything Kaltan had ever experienced. For a species so often dismissed as primitive, the humans were surprisingly efficient in their operations. The ship wasn't luxurious or advanced like the vessels of his own people, but it was functional, every space used for a purpose, and the crew moved with quiet confidence. The human soldiers who had rescued him were cautious, but not hostile. They didn't seem to fear him, though they kept their distance. Kaltan observed them closely, still trying to understand their motivations. His instincts told him not to trust them, that they must have an angle, a hidden agenda. Yet their behavior remained consistent. They were simply helping him. A part of him wondered if they saw him as a curiosity, something to be studied. But if that were the case, why didn't they treat him like a specimen? They had tended to his injuries without unnecessary prodding or invasive questioning. They treated him like one of their own. Days passed, and Kaltan's wounds slowly began to heal. The humans had provided him with medical care that was surprisingly effective. He hadn't expected them to possess the knowledge or technology to treat someone like him, but they adapted quickly. It was something he hadn't anticipated. Humans were more resourceful than his kind gave them credit for. Their adaptability was impressive, though he wouldn't admit it out loud. Communication with the crew was minimal at first. They spoke to him in short, simple phrases, probably assuming he didn't understand their language well. He let them believe that. It gave him time to observe them without having to engage. Kaltan wasn't used to feeling vulnerable, but being on a ship full of humans, injured and alone, left him no choice but to rely on their goodwill. The idea unsettled him deeply. One day, as he rested in his quarters, the same woman who had first approached him after his rescue came to check on his progress. Her name, he had learned, was Captain Reed. She was direct, no-nonsense, and didn't seem to care about his species' reputation. She treated him like any other soldier under her care, and that baffled him. In his world, there was a strict hierarchy. Strength determined your worth. Yet here, Captain Reed showed him respect without knowing his rank or status. "How are you feeling?" she asked, leaning against the doorway. Her tone was casual, almost friendly, but there was an underlying sharpness in her eyes, like she was always assessing the situation. "I am healing," Kaltan replied, his voice gruff. "Your doctors, they are skilled. They've had practice," Reed said with a slight smile. "We're not exactly strangers to war, you know." Kaltan couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. He had never considered humans capable of true warfare. Skirmishes, perhaps, but not on the scale his people were used to. Yet here they were, surviving against the odds, even thriving. He remained silent, unsure of how to respond. Reed didn't push. She simply nodded and made her way to leave, but just before she stepped out, she turned back to him. "You know, not everyone would have helped. Some might have left you out there." Kaltan's chest tightened. It was true, his own people had abandoned him without a second thought. The memory of watching the ships leave him behind still burned in his mind. "Why didn't you?" he asked, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. Reed paused, considering her words. "We help where we can. It's what we do. Maybe that's what makes us different. With that, she left, leaving Kaltan to ponder her words. Different. The idea lingered with him long after Reed was gone. His people had taught him that compassion was a weakness, that showing mercy meant inviting betrayal. Yet the humans didn't operate that way. They were motivated by something else, something Kaltan couldn't quite grasp. In the days that followed, Kaltan found himself increasingly perplexed by the humans. Their resilience was undeniable. Even in the face of hardship, they persevered, using whatever resources they had to keep moving forward. He saw it in the way they maintained the ship, how they rationed their supplies, how they supported each other. They didn't have the advanced technology his people relied on, but they didn't seem to need it. Their strength lay elsewhere. One evening, while walking through the ship's corridors, Kaltan overheard a conversation between two human soldiers. They spoke about their families back on Earth, about how they couldn't wait to return home once the mission was over. It was a strange concept to him, family. His people didn't have the same bonds. They were bred for war, for duty. Attachment was seen as a liability. Yet for humans, these connections seemed to be a source of strength, something that drove them forward even in the most dire situations. As the days turned into weeks, Kaltan's attitude toward the humans began to shift. They weren't the weak, naive creatures he had once thought them to be. There was a quiet strength in them, a determination that went beyond brute force or technological superiority. He saw it in their everyday actions, in the way they cared for each other, in the way they had cared for him, despite having no reason to. But there was still something that troubled him. Why had they rescued him? What did they hope to gain? He had been conditioned to believe that no act of kindness came without a price. It was only a matter of time before they revealed their true intentions. One day, as they neared the end of their journey, Captain Reed came to see him again. She sat down across from him, her expression serious. "We're approaching the rendezvous point," she said. "We'll be dropping you off with a neutral faction that can arrange for your return home." Kaltan felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Return home? To what? His people had abandoned him, left him for dead. And yet, the idea of staying with the humans felt wrong. He didn't belong here, but he no longer knew where he did belong. Reed seemed to sense his inner turmoil. "You don't have to go back, you know," she said quietly. "You've seen what we're about. If you want to stay, there's a place for you here." Kaltan stared at her, stunned by the offer. Stay? With the humans? The idea seemed absurd. And yet, the thought of returning to his own people, to their cold, unfeeling way of life, felt even more unbearable. Will consider it," he said, though even as he spoke, he wasn't sure what his answer would be. As Reed left, Kaltan sat in silence, grappling with the decision before him. The humans had shown him a different way of living, one that valued more than just strength and efficiency. But could he leave behind everything he had known, everything he had been taught? For the first time in his life, Kaltan found himself at a crossroads, unsure of the path ahead. Kaltan couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. The humans had shown him kindness, but the question remained, why? His people operated on cold logic. If someone was injured or weak, they were left behind. It was simple, efficient. Yet these humans defied that logic. Despite his suspicions, he continued observing them, trying to understand their motives. Day after day, they treated him no differently than they treated each other. They spoke little, but their actions spoke volumes. They worked tirelessly to maintain their ship, ration their supplies, and watch over each other. It was a dynamic he had never seen before. In his world, soldiers fought alone, even when part of a unit. Individual performance determined your worth. Here, humans fought for one another, and it was clear that their strength came from their unity. One night, the ship hit a rough patch. Something in the engine malfunctioned, and Kaltan could hear the crew scrambling to make repairs. He wasn't sure what the problem was, but it seemed serious. He could have stayed in his quarters, after all. He wasn't part of their crew. But something urged him to help, even if he wasn't sure how. By the time he arrived at the engine room, the scene was chaotic. The engineers were working with makeshift tools, trying to patch up the damage. The air was thick with tension, but no one panicked. They moved with a calm urgency, coordinating effortlessly to address the problem. Caltan stood back, watching them. It was impressive, the way they worked together, compensating for their lack of advanced technology with sheer determination and ingenuity. It reminded him of something he had once heard about humans, that they were survivors, always finding a way, no matter the odds. He had dismissed it as a myth, but now, seeing them in action, he realized there was truth to it. Without thinking, Caltan stepped forward, offering his assistance. One of the engineers looked up, surprised, but nodded. They didn't question his help, didn't demand to know why he was there. They just accepted it. Caltan took over one of the tasks, using his knowledge of mechanics to aid their efforts. He worked quickly, efficiently, falling into a rhythm alongside them. For a moment, he almost forgot they were from different worlds. Hours passed, but eventually, the ship stabilized. The crew let out a collective sigh of relief, and for the first time since Caltan had boarded, he saw them relax. There were smiles, brief exchanges of gratitude, and then they went back to their duties, as if saving the ship was just another part of their day. It struck him how resilient they were. They had faced a potentially catastrophic failure with calm determination and fixed it with little more than basic tools and a lot of grit. Later, as Caltan returned to his quarters, he thought about the humans' reaction to the crisis. They had worked together as if their lives depended on it, and perhaps they did. But it was more than that. They trusted each other, relied on each other in a way that Caltan had never experienced. In his world, trust was a rare commodity, something earned through loyalty and proven strength. Here, it seemed to be given freely, as though it was the glue that held them together. It was alien to him, yet oddly compelling. Days passed, and Caltan continued to recover. He found himself drawn to the humans, not just as allies but as people. They weren't what he had expected. They joked with each other, shared stories, and even laughed in the face of danger. There was a lightness to them that contrasted sharply with the harsh discipline he had been raised under. It wasn't that they didn't take their duties seriously, far from it. But they carried their burdens differently, with a kind of resilience that Caltan had never seen before. One evening, as Caltan sat in the common area, Captain Reed joined him. She didn't say much at first, just sat beside him, watching the stars through the viewport. After a long silence, she spoke. "You're healing well," she remarked, her tone casual but observant. "Yes," Caltan replied. "Thanks to your crew." Reed nodded, then leaned back, folding her arms across her chest. "You've been helping out around the ship. We appreciate it." Caltan wasn't sure how to respond. It hadn't occurred to him that his efforts would be noticed, let alone appreciated. In his world, you did what was necessary, not for recognition, but because it was expected. "I've never seen a crew like yours," Caltan admitted after a moment. "Where I come from, we don't work together like this." Reed tilted her head, studying him. "Yeah, I gathered that. But you've been watching us, haven't you?" Caltan didn't deny it. "Your people are different. You rely on each other." "We have to," Reed said simply. "Out here, we're all we've got. If we don't trust each other, we don't survive." Caltan considered her words. Trust. It was a concept that had always eluded him. In his world, trust was transactional, based on power and leverage. But here, it seemed to be something deeper, something intrinsic to their survival. "Why did you help me?" he asked, finally voicing the question that had been gnawing at him since his rescue. "You had nothing to gain from it." Reed looked at him for a long moment before answering. "We help because we can. It's not about gain. It's about doing the right thing." The simplicity of her answer left Caltan momentarily speechless. In his world, actions were always calculated, driven by self-interest. The idea of helping someone without expecting anything in return was foreign to him. Reed must have seen the confusion on his face because she added, "I get that it's probably different where you come from. But for us, leaving someone behind just isn't an option." Caltan nodded slowly, still trying to process the concept. For all his training, all the battles he had fought, this simple act of compassion was something he couldn't fully grasp. As the days went on, Caltan found himself increasingly involved in the day-to-day operations of the ship. He wasn't just a passenger anymore. He was part of the crew. The humans treated him as an equal, despite the differences between them. They didn't care that he was from a species known for its ruthlessness. To them, he was just another soldier, trying to survive like the rest of them. And for the first time in his life, Kaltan began to understand the power of unity. The humans weren't strong because of their technology or their individual prowess. They were strong because they stood together, because they fought for each other. It was a strength that couldn't be measured in numbers or firepower, but it was no less real. Kaltan had always believed that strength came from within, from personal ability and resilience. But now, watching these humans, he realized that true strength came from something more, something his people had never understood. They fought for something bigger than themselves. And that, more than anything, made them formidable. The final days aboard the human ship were tense. They had received a transmission from one of Kaltan's people. An enemy ship was on its way, likely to finish the job his own kind had failed to complete. Kaltan felt a surge of conflicting emotions. These were his people, yet the ones coming now were no longer his allies. They would destroy the human ship without hesitation, simply because they viewed the humans as an inferior species, and Kaltan as a traitor for associating with them. The humans, however, did not panic. They moved swiftly, preparing their defenses. Despite knowing they were outmatched in both firepower and numbers, there was no fear in their actions. Kaltan couldn't understand it. His people would have considered retreat or, at least, a tactical withdrawal. But the humans? They dug in, ready to fight. It wasn't pride or arrogance that drove them. It was something else, something Kaltan hadn't fully grasped yet, but could feel stirring in his own heart. As the alien ship approached, Kaltan knew he had a choice to make. He could attempt to contact the approaching forces, plead for mercy, and hope that his status as one of them would spare him. Or he could stand with the humans, these strange, resilient creatures who had shown him more kindness in a few weeks than his own people had in a lifetime. The decision weighed heavily on him. His survival instinct screamed at him to run, to distance himself from the humans and save his own skin. But every time he looked at Captain Reed and the crew, those thoughts felt hollow, like a shadow of the person he once was. These humans had risked their lives for him, not because they expected something in return, but because it was simply the right thing to do. How could he turn his back on them now? As the enemy ship drew closer, Kaltan found himself making preparations alongside the crew. He knew the tactics his people would employ, and advised the humans on how best to counter them. It felt strange, offering up strategies against his own kind, but it also felt right. The humans listened to him, trusted his judgment, even though they knew he had once fought for the enemy. That trust was something new to him, something he wasn't sure he deserved, but he wouldn't let them down. The ship's alarm blared as the enemy vessel entered weapons range. Kaltan could feel the tension in the air, but the humans remained calm, focused. They had fortified the ship's weak points, prepared their weapons, and coordinated their defenses. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. Kaltan admired their tenacity. They knew the odds were against them, but they fought anyway. The first volley of fire struck, shaking the human ship violently. Kaltan braced himself, watching as the humans moved quickly to assess the damage and make adjustments. They didn't flinch, didn't falter. They adapted. They survived. And as the battle raged on, Kaltan realized that he had become one of them. He wasn't just observing anymore, he was fighting alongside them. As the enemy ship continued its assault, Kaltan saw an opportunity. His knowledge of the enemy's tactics allowed him to pinpoint a weak spot in their defenses, something the humans could exploit. He relayed the information to Captain Reed, who nodded and issued the necessary commands. The crew worked in unison, executing the plan with precision. It was a long shot, but it was their only chance. Kaltan's heart raced as the humans prepared to launch their counterattack. He had never felt this kind of adrenaline before, not in any battle he had fought for his own people. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about standing up for something greater than himself. For the first time, he understood what the humans were fighting for. It wasn't glory or conquest. It was for each other, for the bonds they had forged through trust and loyalty. The counterattack hit its mark. The enemy ship staggered, its shields flickering as the humans' weapons found their target. It wasn't a decisive blow, but it was enough to turn the tide. The humans pressed their advantage, and Calton saw the confusion ripple through the enemy ranks. They hadn't expected this kind of resistance from a ship they considered beneath them. It was a mistake that would cost them. As the battle dragged on, Calton's body ached from the strain, but his mind was sharp. He had fully committed to this fight now, not just as an observer, but as a participant. Every decision, every move he made was for the humans. He was no longer the soldier abandoned by his own kind. He was part of something bigger, something that made him feel alive in a way he had never experienced before. The final moments of the battle were chaotic. The enemy ship, now severely damaged, attempted to retreat. But the humans, relentless and determined, pursued them. Calton watched as the human ship unleashed a final volley, striking the enemy vessel and causing it to erupt in a fiery explosion. The humans had won. Against all odds, they had survived. As the smoke cleared and the ship quieted, Calton felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had fought alongside these humans, these so-called primitives, and together they had accomplished the impossible. The crew celebrated quietly, exchanging weary smiles and nods of acknowledgement. There was no grand victory speech, no boasting. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing they had done what needed to be done. Calton sat alone for a moment, reflecting on everything that had transpired. He had been abandoned by his own people, left to die on a barren planet. But the humans, without any obligation, had saved him. They had shown him a different way of living, one that valued loyalty, trust, and compassion. And in the process, they had changed him. Captain Reed approached him, her usual calm demeanor in place. "You did good out there," she said simply, her tone one of respect. Calton nodded, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to this kind of recognition. In his world, praise was rare, reserved only for the most exceptional warriors. But here, it seemed like just another part of the human way of life, acknowledging each other's contributions, no matter how small. "Thank you," Calton finally said, his voice quiet but sincere. Reed gave him a small smile. "We don't leave anyone behind. Remember that." Calton understood now. The humans didn't see him as an outsider or an enemy. They saw him as one of their own, because that's what he had become. He had found a place among them, not through strength or conquest, but through something far more powerful, trust. And as the ship continued its journey through the stars, Calton knew that he would never go back to the life he had known before. He had chosen his side, and for the first time, it felt like the right choice.